You think you know what danger looks like. You imagine it comes with warning signs, a strange feeling in your gut, a shift in the air, a moment where your brain screams run. But sometimes danger walks in wearing a hoodie, smelling like cigarettes and bad decisions, and it moves so fast that your body doesn't even get the message until a cold piece of steel is already pressed against your skin. This is a story about one of those moments. And it's a story about what happens when the wrong person picks the wrong target. Sarah Connolly was 26 years old, 5'4", and the kind of person who still believed that most people were basically decent. She had grown up in a small town in Virginia where you left your car unlocked and your neighbors brought you casseroles when someone died. She had moved to Norfolk 3 years earlier for a job at a logistics company, and she had slowly adjusted to city life the way most small-town people do, carefully and with a lot of new locks on her apartment door. She worked late on Thursdays. Always had. Her boss scheduled the weekly inventory review for Thursday evenings because the warehouse was quieter then, fewer trucks coming in, fewer interruptions. Sarah didn't mind. She liked the stillness of the building after hours, the way the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the whole place felt like it belonged to her for a few hours. What she didn't like was the walk to her car. The parking structure attached to the warehouse was old. Half the lights on the second and third levels hadn't worked in months. Facilities had submitted the maintenance request twice. Nobody had come. Sarah had complained about it to her manager, who had nodded and said he'd follow up, and she knew from the way he said it that he wouldn't. So she did what most women do in a world that doesn't fix its broken lights on time. She adapted. She started parking on the first level, close to the stairwell door. She kept her keys in her hand before she even left the building. She walked fast, and she stayed alert, and she told herself this was just the reality of being a woman alone after dark in a parking garage, and she carried the low-grade weight of that reality the way she carried her work bag, every single day without thinking about it anymore. On that particular Thursday in March, it was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your coat and doesn't leave. Sarah had stayed even later than usual. The inventory system had flagged a discrepancy that took almost an extra hour to track down. By the time she pushed through the stairwell door into the parking structure, it was nearly 9:30. Her car was where she'd left it, third spot from the entrance, under the one light that still worked on that level. She could see it from the door. She walked toward it with her keys already in her hand, thumb on the fob. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps. He was too careful for that. What she heard was his breathing. A slight exhale, too close, from a direction that didn't make sense. She turned her head a fraction of a second before he closed the distance. He was young, maybe 19, maybe 20, lean in a hungry way, not a healthy way. He had on a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, and his eyes were doing something that Sarah's brain processed in a single terrible instant. They were scanning, not seeing. He wasn't looking at her as a person. He was looking at her as a problem to be solved. The knife came up fast. Not a big knife. That's what she would tell people later, as if the size of it mattered. It was a folding blade, the kind you can buy at any gas station, but the edge of it caught the light, and her mind went completely blank the moment she felt the tip of it against the side of her throat. "Don't scream," he said. "Just give me the bag." Her bag was on her left shoulder. It had her wallet, her phone, her work laptop, and a half-eaten granola bar she'd been saving for the drive home. None of that mattered. The only thing that existed in that moment was the cold pressure at her neck and the sound of her own pulse, which had become very loud. She started to slide the bag off her shoulder. That was when Marcus Webb stepped out of the stairwell. He had been working late, too. He worked late most nights because he was new at the company, and new people always worked late, and also because his apartment was too quiet since the divorce, and the office gave him something to do with his hands and his mind. He was 34 years old, and he walked with the kind of easy, unhurried confidence that some men are born with and others have to earn the hard way. Marcus had earned it the hard way. 8 years in the Navy. For deployments. 2 of those deployments doing things he didn't talk about at dinner parties, with a unit whose name most civilians had never heard. He had been out for 2 years now. He worked in supply chain operations because a recruiter had told him his logistics experience translated well, and it turned out that was mostly true. He wore regular clothes and drove a regular car and went to a regular grocery store, and most people who met him thought he was just a tall, quiet guy who was hard to read. He pushed through the stairwell door and saw it in under a second. Girl. Knife. Throat. Bag drop in progress. His brain didn't spike. It didn't flood with adrenaline the way it would have before his training, the way it still did for most people in a moment like this. It went the other way. Everything slowed down and became very precise, like a camera pulling into focus. He saw the angle of the blade. He saw the boy's grip. Right hand, thumb on the spine, nervous hold, not trained. He saw Sarah's body language. Frozen, compliant, trying to make herself small. He saw the distance between himself and the attacker, 12 feet, maybe 13. He saw the lighting. He saw the position of the cars. He saw all of it in approximately 1.5 seconds. He kept walking. That was the thing that Sarah noticed first, later, when she tried to piece it together. He didn't stop. He didn't freeze. He didn't shout or run or do any of the things a normal person does when they walk into something like that. He just kept walking toward them at the same pace he'd been walking, like he was crossing a parking lot to get to his car. Like nothing unusual was happening at all. The attacker saw him. His eyes flicked over, threat assessing, and Marcus gave him nothing to work with. No tension in his body. No widened eyes. No hosetashchen. He looked at the kid with the knife the way you look a slow driver in the lane ahead of you. Mildly inconvenient, already being handled. Hey, Marcus said. Conversational. Almost bored. The kid's grip on the knife shifted. Not much, but enough. Marcus had already calculated that shift before it happened. He closed the last 8 feet in a movement that Sarah's brain could not fully process. She knew it happened. She saw the pieces of it, but the sequence blurred the way fast things always blur when you're running on fear and adrenaline. What she saw was Marcus's left hand coming up and redirecting the knife arm outward and away from her neck, and his right hand going to the kid's wrist, and his body rotating in a way that put the kid off balance before the kid even understood he was off balance. And then the knife was not in the kid's hand anymore, and the kid was against the side of a parked Chevy Suburban with his arm pinned behind him, and his cheek against the cold metal, and Marcus was standing behind him, completely calm, breathing at the same rate he'd been breathing when he walked out of that stairwell. The whole thing took maybe 3 seconds. Sarah was standing there with her bag still on her shoulder. She hadn't finished taking it off. Her hand was shaking. Her brain was trying to catch up to what her eyes had just seen. The kid was not moving. Not because he was hurt, because something in the way Marcus held him communicated, without words, that moving would be a mistake. It wasn't brutality. It wasn't aggression. It was just certainty. The kid had run straight into a wall of certainty, and his body had figured out what his brain hadn't yet, that this situation was completely over. You okay? Marcus said to Sarah, still that same tone, like he was asking if she'd found parking okay. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Take a breath, he said. You're good. She took a breath. The kid underneath his arm made a sound, somewhere between a grunt and a question muffled by the car door. You're going to be fine too, Marcus told him. But you're going to stay right there while she calls the police. And you're not going to do anything that makes this worse for yourself. Understand? The kid said something that might have been yes. Sarah found her phone. Her hands were still shaking, but she dialed. The dispatcher picked up on the second ring, and Sarah started talking, and her voice cracked twice, and she got through it. Marcus didn't move. He didn't shift his hold. He didn't pace or look around or show any sign that holding a mugger against a car in a cold parking garage at 9:30 on a Thursday was anything other than what he happened to be doing right now. And somewhere in the middle of her call to the police, in between giving the address and describing what the attacker was wearing, Sarah looked at this man, this quiet, calm, completely unremarkable-looking man, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief. Not yet. Something older than relief. The recognition that she was safe. Not going to be safe. Not probably safe. Safe. Right now. Completely. She hadn't felt that in a parking garage in 3 years. The police were 12 minutes away. Marcus held that position for all 12 of them. The kid didn't move. Sarah finished her call and stood there in the cold, and her breathing slowly came back to something that resembled normal, and she watched this man who had walked out of a stairwell and changed the entire shape of her evening with the same energy most people bring to checking the weather. She wanted to say something. She went through several options. Thank you felt too small. How did you do that felt too obvious. Who are you felt too personal. She settled on. You work here? Marcus looked at her. Something at the corner of his mouth moved, almost imperceptibly. Third floor, he said. Supply chain. She nodded, as if that explained anything. The parking structure hummed around them. Somewhere on the street outside, a car went past. The kid against the Suburban had stopped making sounds. The cold kept being cold, and Marcus Webb stood there in the dark, patient and still, holding the moment together with both hands until the sirens finally started in the distance and the blue and red light began to pulse through the gaps in the concrete walls, and the long, strange Thursday finally started to end. What Sarah didn't know yet, what she had no way of knowing, standing there in her coat with her granola bar still in her bag, and her heart still knocking against her ribs, was that this was not the last time Marcus Webb would change the shape of her world. It was only the first. The thing about surviving something is that the body takes notes even when the mind tries to move on. Sarah Connolly went back to work the next Friday. She drove to the same parking structure. She took the same spot on the first level, close to the stairwell door. She held her keys in her hand. She walked fast. She told herself she was fine, and that what happened last Thursday was over, and that statistically nothing like that would happen again, and she believed about 60% of that on a good day. The police had taken a report. The attacker, his name was Devin, he was 19, he had 2 prior misdemeanors, was processed, charged, and released on bail within 48 hours. Sarah found that out from the victim services coordinator who called her on Monday, speaking in a measured tone of someone delivering news that landed differently in paperwork than it did in real life. Released on bail sounded administrative, like a form being filed. Not like Devin was back out in the world, somewhere with access to parking garages and folding knives. She didn't tell anyone at work what had happened. She wasn't sure why. It felt like the kind of story that would change the way people looked at her, and she was already tired of being looked at as the girl who got rattled by city living. She was from Virginia, not Mars. She knew the world had hard edges. She had just not expected one of them to press against her throat on a Thursday. Marcus didn't tell anyone either. She knew that because nobody mentioned it. Nobody gave her the soft, careful looks that people give you when they know something happened. The warehouse kept doing what warehouses do. Moving things, counting things, losing things in the system, and finding them again. And Sarah kept doing her part of it. And the week passed the way weeks do when you're pretending something didn't happen as hard as you can. She saw Marcus on Tuesday in the break room. He was making coffee. Real coffee, not the single-serve machine that most people used. He had one of those compact pour-over setups that he apparently kept in his office and had brought down. He was doing it with the same focused patience he seemed to apply to everything, measuring water, watching the bloom. Sarah got a cup from the single-serve machine. The machine gurgled. It always gurgled. That's a lot of effort for coffee, she said. He didn't look up from the pour. Bad coffee is also a lot of effort, he said, just distributed across more days. She didn't have a response to that. She took her coffee and left. She thought about it on the drive home, about the sentence itself, the logic of it, how it was just a true thing said plainly, and how it sounded almost like a joke without trying to be one. She thought about how some people were funny by performing, and some people were funny just by being accurate. She thought about it more than was warranted for a comment about coffee. She ran into him 3 more times that week. Once in the elevator, they rode 4 floors in silence, and it was not uncomfortable, which was notable because Sarah found most silences with near strangers uncomfortable. Once in the hall outside the copy room, where he held the door without making a production of holding the door. Once in the parking lot on Friday evening, where where she walked out to her car at the same time he walked out to his, and they went to their separate vehicles, and she drove home and sat in her apartment and accepted, finally, that she had been thinking about Marcus Webb with a frequency that exceeded what the situation called for. She was a practical person. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She had nearly been robbed at knife point. A man had intervened. Her nervous system had attached itself to his calmness the way a drowning person grabs whatever holds still. That was just biology. That was just the animal brain doing what the animal brain does, finding the safe thing and wanting to stay near it. That was all it was. She told herself this quite firmly on Friday night, sitting on her couch with a glass of wine and a show she wasn't really watching. She almost believed it. The following Wednesday, someone put a sticky note on her office door. It said, in very plain handwriting, *, the parking structure lights on L2 have been fixed. Facilities confirmed this morning. *, no name. No explanation. She stared at it for a long time. She knew it was from him. She didn't know how he'd known the lights had been a problem, except that he was the kind of person who paid attention to things, and apparently that included things that other people had given up trying to fix. She peeled the note off her door and put it in her desk drawer. She kept it there. The first real conversation happened 3 weeks after the parking lot incident. It was a Friday late, the building mostly emptied out, and Sarah had stayed to finish a report, and Marcus had stayed because Marcus apparently always stayed. She was walking past his office when she noticed the door was open and the pour-over was out, and she stopped without quite deciding to stop. "Coffee," he said, without looking up from his screen. She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk, which was neat in a way that didn't look curated. Not the neatness of someone trying to appear organized, but of someone who genuinely found disorder uncomfortable. There were no personal items except a small photo facing away from her and a coffee mug with a Navy anchor emblem that was so worn it had faded almost to nothing. He made her coffee. He handed it to her. He sat back down. "You're doing all right?" he said. Not with the soft, careful weight people put on those words when they mean after the parking garage thing. Just plainly. Like a regular question. "More or less," she said. And then, because he had asked plainly and she was tired of performing fine, the bail thing bothered me more than the actual night. He nodded once. No speech about the justice system. No reassurance. Just a nod, which meant I heard that without adding anything to it. "Does it go away?" she asked. "The parking garage feeling." He looked at his coffee. "It gets quieter," he said. "Doesn't fully go away, but it stops running everything." She asked him how he knew that. Not about the parking garage specifically, about the feeling. He was quiet for a moment. The building hummed. "Experience," he said. She didn't push it. She heard in that one word the compressed weight of a sentence that was actually 40 pages long. And she was smart enough to know that 40 pages was not what he was offering right now. They talked for an hour. About Norfolk, about where they'd grown up, about the job. About supply chain inefficiencies that they both found genuinely irritating, which turned out to be the most surprisingly comfortable common ground she'd found with anyone in 3 years in that city. He was funny in the way she'd noticed before. Not performed, just accurate. He said something once that made her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in a while, the kind that catches in your chest before it gets out. When she looked at the time, it was almost 8:30. "I should go," she said. He stood when she stood, which was a reflex so natural that she didn't think he even noticed doing it. "I'll walk out with you," he said. She wanted to say she was fine, that she had her keys, that it was only the first level. She didn't say any of that. They walked out together, and the first level was well lit and completely empty, and nothing happened except that she got her car, and he got in his, and she drove home feeling the strange, quiet weight of something she was not quite ready to name. They started eating lunch together. It was not a decision either of them announced. It happened the way small gravitational things happen, incrementally, and without a clear starting point. One day she was walking to the break room, and he fell in a step beside her, and then that was just what Wednesdays looked like, and then Tuesdays, and then most days they were both in the building. She learned things in pieces. He was from Jacksonville, North Carolina, small town, military family, 3 brothers, all of them with some version of the same story. He had enlisted at 18, the same week he graduated high school, because he had known since he was 12 years old that was what he was going to do. He didn't talk about the specific work except in oblique references she learned to read. When we were in country, there was a situation, and she learned not to ask for the fill-in because he wasn't withholding it to be mysterious. He was withholding it because some things are load-bearing walls, and if you pull them out, the structure falls. She learned he was divorced. He didn't say much about that either. Just once, offhandedly, he mentioned that his ex-wife had needed someone who was actually present, and that he'd been gone too much, and that she hadn't been wrong. He said the way you say something you've already finished being sad about. Not flat, not healed, just settled. She told him things too, about growing up in a town where everyone knew your name, and most of them had opinions about it. About moving to Norfolk the week after she ended a 4-year relationship with someone who was kind but wrong in the way that takes years to admit. About how the city had been lonelier than she'd expected, and how she'd adjusted, and how most of the time she was okay, and some of the time she was very specifically not okay. He listened the way he did everything, fully, without fidgeting, without preparing his next sentence while she was still talking. One Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the parking garage, she was in his office, and they were supposed to be reviewing a vendor contract, and neither of them had looked at the contract in 45 minutes, and she was in the middle of telling a story about her mother's casserole at a neighbor's funeral when she looked up and found him watching her with an expression that was not quite neutral. She stopped mid-sentence. He didn't look away. The building was quiet. The fluorescents hummed. Somewhere in the contract on his desk, there was a clause about net payment terms that was never going to get reviewed that night. What? She said. Nothing, he said. But the word came out different than usual. Softer. And the expression didn't change. Sarah Connolly was a practical person. She had a good brain, and she used it. She had told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that what she felt around Marcus Webb was biology and proximity and gratitude dressed up as something else. She was sitting in his office at 7:40 on a Thursday evening, no contract reviewed, Hart doing something that didn't feel like biology or proximity or gratitude. She was going to have to revise her position on this. She looked back down at the contract. Net 30 days, she said, pointing at the clause. Unacceptable, he said. Completely, she said. They reviewed the contract. They were both very professional. When she left that night, he walked her to her car, and she drove home, and she sat in her apartment, and she did not turn on the television, and she did not pour wine, and she just sat with the feeling for a while. The feeling sat back. She had been alone in this city for 3 years. She had built her life here carefully, the way you build something in a place where the ground doesn't always stay still, with good foundations and small steps and the constant low-level management of expectations. She had stopped expecting the kind of safety she'd grown up with, the bone-deep knowledge that someone was looking out. She had accepted that adulthood in a city you moved to alone meant being the person who looked out for yourself. And then a man had walked out a stairwell and changed the geometry of her world. She picked up her phone. She set it down. She picked it up again. She typed, *, the vendor wants net 30. I told them unacceptable. They pushed back. * word text. Legitimate. Nothing about feelings in it at all. 3 seconds later, * hold the line. We don't pay in 30 days for that turnaround. * she was smiling before she could stop herself. She put the phone face down on the couch cushion and sat in the dark with her smile and her feeling and the terrifying, unwelcome, completely inconvenient understanding that she was falling for a man she worked with who kept his past in compression files and walked into dangerous situations like they were Tuesday and held the world still with both hands when everything around him was moving. She was going to handle this very carefully. She was absolutely going to make a mess of it. Both things were true. The mess started on a Tuesday. It started specifically at 11:43 in the morning when Sarah walked past the conference room on the 3rd floor and saw Marcus sitting across from a woman who was not a coworker. Sarah knew all the coworkers. This woman was not one of them. She was in her early 30s, dark-haired, the kind of composed that doesn't come from calm, but from practice, and she was leaning slightly forward with her hands folded on the table, and she was saying something that made Marcus look at the table instead of at her. Sarah kept walking. She went back to her office. She sat down. She opened a spreadsheet. She closed the spreadsheet. She told herself she had no claim on Marcus Webb. They were colleagues who had lunched together and walked to the parking garage together and texted about vendor payment terms. Nothing had been said. Nothing had been offered or accepted. She had no standing to feel the thing she was currently feeling, which was something she was going to describe to herself as concern and not as jealousy, because she was a practical person and practical people did not get jealous over a man they had not even technically been on a date with. She reopened the spreadsheet. She entered 2 numbers, both of them wrong. At 12:15, Marcus knocked on her open door. He was holding 2 coffees from the place across the street. Not the building break room, the actual coffee shop, which meant he had gone out, which meant this was a deliberate gesture, which meant something. "You saw that," he said. Not a question. "I'll walk by the conference room," she said. Neutral. Professional. Eyes on the spreadsheet. He set 1 coffee on her desk. He sat in the chair across from her. He did the thing he always did. Waited until the space felt ready. Didn't try to fill it before it was. "That's my ex-wife," he said. The spreadsheet stopped matching. "She's in Norfolk for work," he said. "She wanted to meet." I don't know what I thought. He picked up his coffee. Put it down. "I thought it would be easier than it was." Sarah looked at him. He was looking at his coffee again, the way he had that night in the office over the vendor contract. Not avoiding, just processing. He was a man who processed out loud only after he'd already processed most of it internally, and right now something had bypassed that system. "Are you okay?" she said. He looked up. "I will be," he said. And in the gap between okay and will be, Sarah heard everything he wasn't saying. She heard it the way you hear something that's been said in a different language you're still learning. You don't get every word, but the meaning comes through clearly. He had loved someone and lost them not to catastrophe, but to the slow erosion of a life that kept pulling him away, and he had accepted that loss as something that made sense, and today the loss had walked back into a conference room and sat down across from him and folded its hands on the table, and it had been harder than he'd prepared for. She didn't say any of that. She picked up the coffee he'd brought her. She took a sip. "It's good," she said. "They grind it fresh," he said. "I know," she said. "You've mentioned." Something in his face shifted, just slightly. The processing backed down a notch, and something else came up behind it. They had lunch that day in her office with the door closed, and neither of them talked about the ex-wife again. They talked about a distribution routing problem that had been irritating them both for a week. They solved it mostly. It felt like the right thing to do with a complicated afternoon. Take a problem with a solution and solve it together, and let the completion of that small, useful thing be the thing that steadied the hour. He left at 1:30. He paused at the door. "Thank you," he said. She didn't ask for what. She knew. "Go do some work," she said. He did. 3 days later, on a Friday evening, with the building nearly empty and the March cold pressing against the windows, Marcus came to her office doorway and said, "Do you want to have dinner that's not in this building?" Not a question. Almost a question. The space where the question mark should have been was doing something more interesting than a question mark. Sarah saved her document. She looked at him. "Are you asking me to dinner?" she said. "Yes," he said. "That was not phrased like a question," she said. "I know," he said. She got her coat. They went to a restaurant 3 blocks from the office that was loud on weekends, but quiet on Fridays, and they sat in a corner booth and ordered food that they only partially ate because they were talking too much to remember to eat. They talked about everything and nothing with the ease of people who had been talking for weeks and had crossed some invisible line into a register where everything felt permitted. The embarrassing things, the contradictory things, the things that didn't resolve neatly. She told him about the relationship that had ended before she moved here. She didn't dress it up. For years, good man, wrong fit, and the saddest part had not been the ending, but the moment she realized she'd been performing contentment for so long she'd forgotten what the real thing felt like. He told her things she hadn't heard before. About a deployment that had gone wrong in a specific way he described only in its aftermath, not its details. About the 6 months after he got out, when he had not known what to do with his hands, with his time, with the silence of a life that was no longer organized around mission and consequence. About finding, slowly, that ordinary things could be enough. Coffee made correctly, a problem solved, a conversation with someone who didn't flinch at the weight of him. That last phrase landed in her chest like something she needed to hear and hadn't known it. "Do people flinch?" she said. He considered it. "Sometimes," he said, "when they learn what the work was, what it required. Does it bother you?" "Used to," he said. "Not so much now." She studied his face across the booth. He was not handsome in a way that made you stupid. He was something better than that, something that took longer to land, a face that revealed more the longer you looked at it. She had been looking at it for 2 months, and she was still finding things. "I don't flinch," she said. He held her eyes. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." The restaurant got busier around them. A table of 6 came in loud, and the music got turned up, and the Friday energy started building, but their corner stayed still, the way certain spaces hold their own atmosphere regardless of what's happening around them. When they left, it was cold, and she had not worn a heavy enough coat, and he didn't make a production of it. He just shifted slightly so that his shoulder was between her and the wind as they walked, the most natural thing in the world. And she thought, this is what it looks like when someone just does the thing instead of asking if you want them to do the thing. They walked back to the parking structure together. Her car was on the first level. His was on the second. At her car door, she turned to face him. There was a pause. Not an awkward one. The kind of pause that has weight, that means both people are deciding something simultaneously and are waiting to see if they decide the same thing. "This was good," she said. "Yes," he said. "We should do it again," she said. "We will," he said. Present tense. Not "we should," or "I'd like to." "We will," as if it was already a fact that had happened, and they were just catching up to it. She unlocked her car. She looked at him once more. "Good night, Marcus." "Good night, Sarah." She drove home, feeling something she hadn't felt in long enough that it took her a minute to identify it. Not excitement. Excitement was loud and unsettled. This was quieter. This was the feeling of a thing being in the right place after being out of place for a long time. She didn't call anyone. She didn't text. She just let it be what it was, large and real and hers. And she sat with it in her apartment in the dark the same way she'd sat with the fear in the parking garage 2 months ago, except that this time she wasn't trying to make it smaller. The following weeks moved the way good things move, forward and with gathering warmth. They had dinner again, and again. He came to her apartment once, and she cooked badly, and he fixed the part she'd gotten wrong without making her feel bad about the part she'd gotten wrong, which was so precisely the right response that she filed it as data about who he was. She went to his place, which was spare and ordered and smelled like coffee and had a bookshelf with a specific mix of military history, philosophy, and 1/3 of a shelf of novels that all seemed to be about the sea, which she found endearing in a way she didn't entirely understand. She met one of his brothers, the middle one, passing through Norfolk, and the brother looked at her and then at Marcus and said something quiet and private, and Marcus said something back, and the brother laughed, and she caught enough of it to understand she had been discussed with approval. She introduced him to her friend Kalechi, who called her the next morning and said, "Oh, I see," in a tone that contained an entire essay. What she came to understand over time was not that Marcus was uncomplicated. He was not at all, but that his complications were the honest kind. He carried weight. He had a past that was built differently than most people's pasts. He was still learning to live in a life that was not organized around urgency. He had a quiet in him that was not emptiness, but something more like the quiet after a long, hard job is done. The stillness of a person who had been many things and was figuring out deliberately and without shortcuts who he was going to be now. She was figuring out who she was going to be too. She had come to this city to rebuild herself after a relationship that had hollowed her out slowly, and she had done that rebuilding carefully and with good foundations, and she had been so focused on the building that she had not left much room for anything she hadn't planned. Marcus was not something she had planned. He was something that had walked out of stairwell and changed the geometry of her world, and she had spent 2 months carefully explaining that to herself as biology and gratitude and proximity, right up until the moment she stopped explaining it and just let it be what it was, which was this: she trusted him. Not because he had once held a parking garage together with both hands while she called the police, though she thought about that more than she admitted. Not because he was steady in ways that most people aren't, though he was. Not because he had brought her coffee and fixed her routing problem and walked her to her car in the cold. She trusted him because when she spoke, he heard the actual thing she was saying, not the version he expected. Because when she told him something that mattered, he held it carefully, the way you hold something breakable, not frozen, not overcautious, just aware of what it was worth. She had not had that before. She had not known, fully, what she was missing until she found it. On a Saturday in late May, they were sitting on the waterfront at a park not far from his apartment, the kind of late afternoon that Norfolk does in spring when the harbor is calm and the light is going gold and the city looks almost tender. She had her head on his shoulder. His hand was around her coffee cup because she'd handed it to him to hold while she searched for her sunglasses, and she found her sunglasses and never taken the cup back, and he was still holding it, which was just a small domestic nothing except that it wasn't nothing at all. She thought about the parking garage. She thought about the cold and the knife and the moment her brain had gone blank with fear. She thought about him walking out of that stairwell, unhurried, absolutely certain, and the way the whole terrible shape of that night had changed in 3 seconds. She thought about Devin, who was 19 and hungry in a bad way, and who had looked at her and seen a problem to be solved and had picked up a knife to solve it. She wondered sometimes what became of people like Devin, whether the charges stuck, whether any of it changed anything. She hoped, with a specific and unsentimental compassion, that something somewhere along the line went differently for him than it seemed like it was going to. She thought about how a parking garage with broken lights had set everything in motion, how the maintenance request that nobody followed up on had been, in some indirect and absurd way, the beginning of all of this. She was going to tell Marcus that sometime. She was going to tell him that the broken lights were partially responsible for the current situation and watch him figure out whether that was a compliment or a complaint. She thought it would make him laugh. The real one. The one he didn't do often. The one that made the quiet in him go temporarily away. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just hey." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. Brief and easy. The kind of thing you do when you've moved past performing and arrived somewhere real. The harbor was calm. The light was going. The coffee was going cold in his hand, and neither of them said anything about that. And Sarah Connolly, who had moved to a city that didn't fix its lights and had adapted by holding her keys tight and walking fast and keeping her expectations low, sat in the warm April evening and felt the very specific, unexpected, slightly irritating fullness of a life that had gone sideways from the plan and ended up somewhere better. Not perfect. Not neat. Not resolved in the way that things resolve in stories where the plot is in charge. Just this. The shoulder. The harbor. The coffee going cold. The man beside her who walked into danger like it was Tuesday and held still things in place and brought her coffee from the good place and did not ask her to make herself smaller to fit into his life. This was enough. More than enough. And somewhere in Norfolk, in a parking structure with lights that finally worked on every floor, the first level sat empty and bright and completely ordinary. Just a parking level, nothing else, like nothing had ever happened there at all. Except that something had. And it had changed everything.